Okay. All right, so we're live here. Who are you, sir?
My name's Eno Toole. I'm a graphic designer and an illustrator, and I work in board games.
Okay. Well, how did you get started in the board game hobby?
Oh, Lord. Well, I guess going way back, as a kid, I played a lot of D&D, a lot of different role-playing games, Middle-earth role-playing game, Dark Future, Cyberpunk, lots of different ones. Um, then I took a break from it, probably, through college and all that. And then probably about 8 years ago, 8 years ago, a friend bought me Settlers of Catan, basically, as a birthday present, and like most, that kind of sucked me in.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, Settlers and closely followed by Dominion.
Okay. Yeah, I came on a little bit after that, after Catan and all that. I've only been in it for like 4 years or so.
Right.
My gateway game was Pandemic. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it was kind of around about the time that we had our first child, so staying in a lot more rather than going out, and yeah, it just kind of evolved out of there.
Yeah, from a lot of people, I hear that it's a need to stay home for whatever reason, child or money or whatever.
Yep.
So I'm assuming you took graphic design in college, right?
Yeah, visual communications is what they called it, but yeah, essentially graphic design.
Okay, so what
Yeah, so
made
I did.
you? Oh, good.
What made me pick it?
Well, yeah.
Um, that's a really good question. It's a while ago now. I think it was mostly because I saw it as a practical skill that I could actually get a job at. I'd always been into drawing and illustrating, but it's very, very difficult to find at least full-time employment as an illustrator. And since I knew I'd always kind of keep that up myself and do that myself, I figured graphic design was a more marketable skill to have.
Okay. So
Yeah,
so
so
what made you?
sorry, go ahead.
What made you decide to go into the board game end of graphic design?
Um, just basically, I wanted to spend more time around games, pretty much. I started working for myself probably 3 years ago now, and then really out of curiosity, I started posting work around BGG, and got some interest. Worked on a few games, and then it just kind of grew from there, pretty organically.
Is there? Do you have a lot of competition in this? I can't imagine you do. But do you have? Is there a ton of competition in the board game end?
I don't know, to be honest. I don't think that there. I mean, there's a lot of people doing artwork for board games. They don't tend to talk to each other very much. They don't tend to be all that active on social media and things like that. So I don't know. I've never really found it that difficult to find work. I guess one of the things that I do that's maybe a little different is I do both. I do graphic design and illustration. So I can, produce the entire game, besides the game design, obviously, which is pretty useful for a lot of publishers because, then they've got one person to talk to, and they're not worried about illustrations coming in and not being suitable for print, etc., etc.
All right. For those who may not know what the difference is between illustration and graphic design, could you give me like 20-second rundown? Yeah.
Sure. Graphic design is essentially about communication. So things like clarity of layout, communication through use of color and icons and typography, all of that stuff falls under graphic design, whereas illustration is also about communication, but in a much different way, a much more different way. Illustration is essentially the pictures, if you want to put it as simply as that. From my perspective, the two kind of blend together quite a bit. It's hard to tell where one ends and one begins because I just do them both kind of organically. But I guess in a typical scenario, if you're talking about, let's say, box art, for instance, an illustrator would produce the image and a graphic go, any typography that goes on the box, publishers' logos, those little symbols for how long the game lasts and how many players and all that sort of stuff. That's pretty much the difference.
Okay. Yeah, I kind of, over in America, I think we refer to illustration as artwork. But I hear people intertwine graphic design and illustration.
Yeah, I think the term artwork and artist is something that's used quite a lot in board games. I think it's really misleading.
So
because well, illustration is commercial art.
Okay.
That's kind of what it is. So when you're an illustrator, you typically get a brief from a client, which is exactly the same as with graphic design. The client wants something in particular. You go through various stages of sketches and feedback and all that sort of stuff until you arrive at the final image, which is what the client wants. When you talk about art, it sounds like it's a little more self-driven. I think there's a little bit of a danger, not a danger, but there's a little bit of a misunderstanding when you use the term art. Illustration in board games and in most commercial situations has a purpose to fulfill. And that purpose isn't always to picture. That's that's part of it. But there's also a purpose of, style for the company, for the publishers. There's a branding consideration there. Some publishers always use the same style of artwork.
Right.
To break from that would be to break from their branding. Sometimes the target market obviously needs to be taken into account with styles and content and all of that. So I just think there's an important distinction between commercial art and art, or artist and illustrator, and that sort of thing.
Okay.
That makes sense?
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm curious as to what the board game, environment down there in Australia is like. Is it do you do it like go to conventions once a year to buy your games for the year like they do up in Germany, or is it more like America?
It's really good and really bad at the same time. It's really bad for the prices of games, the cost of games, because they're just really expensive. Just to do a quick I don't know what the conversion rate is at the moment, but a game like, let's say, a big Fantasy Flight game like Forbidden Stars, for instance, is, I don't know how much it retails for in the States, but here it's about $160 Australian.
Okay. Yeah, it's about 100 here. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. So if you're ever ordering online, shipping costs are atrocious. With Kickstarter, you've got to at least get in a group of 6 or 10 other people to bring the shipping down to something reasonable. So from that point of view, it's not great, but there is a really, really healthy board game community here, at least in Perth, which is where I am. I'm way over in the west in Western Australia, so we're pretty isolated. But I am part of an association called WABA, which is the West Australian Board Game Association. And we run a meet every 2 weeks, and they get about 60, 70 people typically. As well as that, we've got 1, 2, 3, maybe 4 game stores in the sort of greater area, most of which will have weekly game nights and things like that. So it's pretty healthy. It's pretty active here.
Cool.
And then as regards conventions, we've got a few small ones which I've not been to, because Perth is, again, pretty isolated. So we don't have many here. We have a PAX here, PAX Australia, which has been running the last 3 years, and they've got a pretty good tabletop presence. So yeah, it's better than you might expect.
Yeah, I'm always curious as to cultural differences. Yeah. Like, I talked to a guy, over in England and all that, and it's like it is over here. But you talk to a guy in Germany, it's a lot lower key. Yeah, I'm always curious as to differences to that. Even here,
Sure.
it depends on your location. Like, board gaming is big on the West Coast and the northern part of the country, more or less. Not so much like where I'm at, like the Mid-Atlantic side of it, or down in Florida. It's not as big here as it is over out west and up north.
Yeah.
A lot of it's got to do with the cold, I'm sure, with the northern guys. But
sure, yeah. Well, we don't have that problem here, so it's the opposite problem. It's too hot to go outside.
So, how did you get involved with? What was the first game that you illustrated or did graphic design for?
The very first game that I produced a little bit of graphic design for was called Mage Tower, which is was a little Kickstarter co-op tower defense card game.
Okay.
I did some card design for that. The first one was Fool's Gold by Joshua Balvin, which is only recently been released. I had a bit of a long percolation period. Yeah, that would have been the first one that I worked on. When I worked on it, Joshua was intending to kickstart it, but then it was picked up by Passport Studios. So,
do you find most of your business is Kickstarters?
No, not anymore. No, I get a lot of inquiries about Kickstarters, and I guess it's pretty easy to find work in that area, but it's also a lot more unreliable.
Okay.
Budgets tend to be a lot lower or non-existent at times. Tend to want to pay you after if the project funds, and there's also things like timelines and things like that tend to stretch out a lot. So I've done a few. Fool's Gold was originally supposed to be a Kickstarter. Stockpile was a Kickstarter, as is the expansion that's upcoming. And I guess, they're a first-time publisher, and technically the Gallerist and Vinyos were Kickstarters, but I don't really count them because, Eagle Gryphon are fairly well established.
Yeah. What was it like working on Study Emerald? That was a busy board,
Yeah, it was. It was really good. I met Martin at PAX, actually. He was running guesting on a panel over there, and I sat down to playtest ships with him. And I had previously emailed him and told him what I did, and said it'd be nice to sit down and have a chat with him, because he was a publisher, obviously, at that time as well. So I showed him some of the stuff that I had, and he liked it, and he, as we were, looked at me and said, "Do you know anything about H.P. Lovecraft?" Which was a big deal, because I'm a big H.P. Lovecraft fan. And then he mentioned, I had no idea that he was planning a second edition of A Study in Emerald.
Right.
I was aware of the game. I played half a game, which didn't quite work out. But I was pretty aware of how the game worked, and I was certainly aware of how it looked. Prototype, he gave it to me to take home and play, and yeah, it was really nice. Martin's really good to work with. Yeah, it was really good to work on. It's an interesting world. There's lots of different things to draw upon. The Victorian London, all those characters that are also real characters, or real people, I should say, that Martin's put into the game, and then also crazy monsters.
Yeah. Is that how you go by most of your design work? Is it you play the game and then you go from there, or do you have something set in your mind before you go in? Or
if possible, I'll play the game. I'll play the game at some point during the process, either to figure out how it works or to done and make sure it works. Because you can't really tell until you've got it on the table in front of you.
Right.
If you're gonna, if you've put something in a place where it's too easy to knock it over, or all this type of ergonomic issues that crop up when you actually play a game. So yeah, I'll typically try and play it. Usually I'll be sent a prototype or just files that I'll need to construct.
Okay. Now, is there a big difference between like the board game end of it and say like doing a commercial logo or graphic design for public companies instead?
Yes. Yes, there is. Yeah, there's a pretty substantial difference. The board game industry is still run by hobbyists, primarily.
Yeah.
Not run by hobbyists, but populated by hobbyists. And most of the people that I deal directly with are designers as opposed to publishers. While a lot of times I will do the work for publishers, my direct contact is typically with the designers. That goes both ways. You get very, very passionate people, which is great that you work with. People who are really excited to be doing what they're doing. But the flip side of that is it's not it's very few people's day jobs. So people's hours are irregular. My hours are irregular anyway, being where I live, living where I do. It's not unusual to be having Skype calls at midnight and things like that, just because where you are, or in Europe. But apart from that, I guess budgets is a big thing. Board game budgets not always, but tend to be significantly lower than in most other industries for commercial creative work. Particularly illustration, actually, is a weird one. Not as much graphic design, but particularly for illustration. Some of the, when you look around Board Game Geek, some of the generally accepted costs that you can get illustration for are just so low so ridiculously low that, I mean, they might be okay if you're a student and you live at home and you're doing it, between other things. But for any sort of professional illustrator, they're not sustainable. So they would be the main differences.
Yeah, I do hear that sustainable thing a lot. It was actually part of an argument between two publishers, Kickstarter publishers, arguing about artwork. And one was like, these guys should be paid what they're worth, and the other guy's like, you can't, you'll go over budget, blah blah blah. So I'm sure that's constant battle for guys like you, especially with the bigger companies. You don't want to pay anything like FFG and all them.
Yeah, it's a bit of a. I think it's a bit of a hurdle that the industry needs to get over. And I mean, it's not just, to be honest, artists typically get paid better than designers. Sorry, graphic designers and illustrators typically get paid better than game designers, which is ludicrous, frankly.
Yeah.
It's one of those things where, the hobby we constantly hear that the hobby is growing and getting bigger, but it's fueled by designers. It's fueled by creativity and people who are passionate enough to create all these incredible games. But I wonder how sustainable that is when very few people are making any decent money out of it.
Do you know how many full-time graphic artists there is in the hobby, or is there any
full-time graphic artists,
or like your guys?
Right? Sure. No, I have no idea. There are some, but not many. I mean, at the moment, board gaming is probably about 50% of what I do.
Okay.
And to do any more than that is quite difficult, because you've got to increase the volume so much to make up for the shortfall
Right.
in money, which is really difficult because board game work is very time consuming anyway.
Yeah, that was actually my next question. Is it like faster to make a logo for a company or artwork for a card, or what's it different?
I mean, it really depends. I've worked on corporate logos that have taken months, and I've worked on ones that have taken half an hour. It really, really varies. And the same with board games. They typically err on the longer side. They're typically at least a few months, the entire project. But I mean, that's not working full time on one project. That's juggling a couple of things.
Right. All right. Well, let's say like Nemos War. How long? You're the illustrator and the graphic designer on that, right?
Yep.
How long did it take you to sit down with that? I know you're still going back and forth with finalization.
That's a bit of a special exception. That one has taken a while. That one's taken a good while. The reason being is that I really wanted to work on that game. It's just a fantastic game. I adore the first edition. And when I caught wind of the fact that they were making a second one, I immediately wrote to Victory Point Games and said, "Here's." And I hadn't really done anything at the time. I had done Fool's Gold, but it hadn't been published, so it wasn't really out there. And I didn't really have anything that was stylistically similar to anything that would suit Nemos War. But anyway, I wrote to them and I just said, I really love the game. If you haven't already assigned a graphic artist, I would love to be involved. And luckily enough, luckily enough, they came back and said, sure, yep, no problem.
So how long
it was
oh, sorry, go.
Sorry, I was going to say it was about a 2-year period.
It's been in the plate work that long? Huh.
It's now during that period the game was also being developed in conjunction with me creating the artwork. So it did kind of come in fits and starts. So I'd, get a board prototype and would go away and be tested and developed, and then it would come back to me and I'd be able to work on it a bit more. So I mean, that's not constantly working on it. But it's been a long process, which is nearly. But yeah, I mean, that's an exception because that falls under the sort of passion project thing for me, where I've spent more time on that game than I could ever hope to recoup in compensation.
Yeah, the artwork. I was looking. I backed it. I was looking at some of the updates the other day, and the artwork is beautiful. What you've been sending recently, or what you're finalizing.
Cool. Thank you. Yeah, it's it's getting there, and I mean they've really put their Victory Point Games, that is, have really sort of stood behind it and pushed it, and they seem really happy with it. So yeah, it's good. I'm looking forward to finally getting the final product.
So do you get a copy from all the games that you design, like a finished copy, or no?
Usually, yeah. I usually get one or two, a few copies.
I was just curious because I know like designers usually get 10 or 15 or whatever. But I wasn't sure about other people down the pipeline,
Yeah, usually that will happen. I mean, typically at least in my experience, anyone who worked significantly on the game will get a copy, which includes developers and things like that.
Okay, cool. All right. Well, I usually ask my guests a set of questions, so I guess we'll get into that.
Okay.
The first one is, what is a game that you love and everybody else seems to hate?
Oh, game that I love. There's a few, I guess. Well, the first one is I don't think everybody seems to hate it, but a lot of people dislike it. Would be Race for the Galaxy. Is one of my very, very favorite games. It's probably joint favorite with Glory to Rome. And I constantly hear people don't like it. It's too complex. It's hard to learn. The iconography is impenetrable. I don't see that. I mean, part of that's probably because I'm a graphic designer, so that's kind of my language. But I've never had a problem teaching it. I don't think Roll for the Galaxy replaces it. At least not for me. Yeah. So that's one, I guess. But I mean, that's a really popular game by itself anyway, Race. So I can't really say that everybody hates it. The other is Archipelago, which I really, really like, and a lot of people don't.
Yeah, that one's been on my radar. I just haven't picked it up yet. So,
it's really, really great. It's not like anything else. It's got a few weird ways that the game can end, and I think that bothers people, especially for a game that's substantial in length. It's probably about a 2 to 3 hour game.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons I haven't got it. The family here's a little touchy with time, lengthy games.
Sure, and you really need at least 4 players. 5 is probably best. It's not 2 or 3. I probably would just play something else, I think. Okay. So that's all I can think of.
All right, so the next question is the reverse. What's one that you hate and everybody seems to love?
that I hate and everybody seems to love. I have games I strongly dislike. I think hate hate is a little strong. Wow. Dice Town is a game I really don't enjoy. That's pretty popular. I don't know. There aren't that many games I feel that negatively about. Yeah, we'll go with that.
Okay. So the final question is, if say you were stuck on a deserted island and you could bring one game and play it with anybody, who would that person be and what game would it be? And the person could be alive or dead, fictional. Yeah.
Wow. Oh dear. The game would probably be Glory to Rome, because it is my favorite and most played game, and it's still extremely fresh. Oh my god, the person. I don't know. I could be really, really cheesy and say my wife, because she's my best competitor in that game. Say that.
Okay. Yeah, I was actually just going to ask: is your wife in it a hobby? I guess so.
Not as a hobby, but she does play a lot of games. We play a lot of games together. She was part of my initial, when we originally played Settlers of Catan. There were 3 or 4 of us, including my wife, who used to play it a lot. Then on to Dominion, and then as 2 of us kind of accelerated our interest and started acquiring and playing lots and lots of new games, and she kind of burnt out on it a little bit, and then slowly kind of came back in. But she really likes Glory to Rome. She really likes Race for the Galaxy. We've played tons of games. Agricola, Summoner Wars. Yeah, quite a few games. We just finished. Well, not just finished, but over Christmas we played Pandemic Legacy together.
Okay.
In about 5 days, we finished the entire thing.
Yeah, Jen and I are still working on it. We got through about 4 or 5 months, and then we just stopped for a little bit. We got to get back to it though.
Yeah, we did it in a big hurry. We were really excited about it, and we just kept playing it. It was over the Christmas holidays, and the kids were on holidays, and we didn't have too much to do, so probably about 4 games a day.
Wow,
thereabouts. Yeah.
Well, it's only about an hour a game, so that's not too bad, I guess.
Yeah. You get through them pretty quick.
Yeah.
Yeah. Are you enjoying it so far?
Yeah, I gotta get back to it. It's been a couple months. My wife's actually getting burnt out on that board games now. It's
right.
Part of it's just the channel I run. We're constantly learning new games. She's a little tired of that. I'm constantly reading rule books and all that. And,
that was kind of the same with Sarah, my wife. She's quite competitive when it comes to games. In fact, Pandemic Legacy is the only co-op that she's ever played. Really? At least certainly the only one she's ever enjoyed. She, as a rule, does not like co-ops. Doesn't really see the point of them. So for her, it's very frustrating to play one game and then a new game and then a new game and never really get into the depth of strategy in any of those games, and just constantly be playing your first game.
Yeah.
Which is why, over the last few months, we've just played Glory to Rome probably up to 10 times a week. Because 2-player games really fast, so we'll just sit down and play 3 games, and we'll just we've really sort of digging into the game. which is what she prefers, and is really good for me too, actually.
So
because I've got I've got game groups. So I've got game groups I can go off and play the new games and all that sort of stuff. But it's good to have a partner at home that you can play the old favorites with.
Yeah, I'm actually looking for a gaming group here. I game with the Secret Cabal guys up in PA every other week, but down here I live outside of a college town, so I didn't really like the vibe at the game store there. I don't get their humor.
Sure.
So I'm still looking for something. Try to relieve the pressure off her a little bit. So which Glory Realm do you have? The black box or the other one? The original?
The black box.
It's a shame that'll never come back out to light, with the legal stuff.
Yeah. It might, I guess, at some point. It would be a big shame if it didn't. I've taught it to a lot of people, and it's a bit of a shame to say, if you want a copy, it's going to cost you $200 or whatever. But mine's pretty. It's in good condition, but it's been played a lot. So I'm thinking about shelling out the cash for a second copy. I play it that much. There's no question of value, but it makes sense to spend on a card game.
Yeah. Did you like that? Was it Maya Time? The newest version of it that he came out with?
Matai,
I
think. Yeah, I did. We play tested it when it was in development, and with our game group, and we all really didn't like it.
Really?
But then I think they tweaked a couple of things. I don't even know what they were, to be honest. It was a while ago. And when we actually got our copies and started playing it, I really like it. It's not a replacement at all. It's too short-lived.
Yeah.
Glory to Rome can be very short-lived if certain things happen. But that's part of the game, is controlling the pace and figuring out when you're ahead and when to end the game and how to end the game and all that sort of stuff. It's so easy for anyone to end the game in Matanai at any point that you don't really ever want to dig into it. You want to dig into it, but you're not really able to.
Right.
So I do like it, but it's not a replacement. I'm a big fan of all of his games. Innovation is a big one for me. I like Innovation quite a bit, and I really love Impulse, which is horrendously underrated, I think.
Yeah, I think it is too. And the artwork is horrible on that. It's
yeah. Yeah, I hear that a lot. You'd think I'd be more picky because of what I do. It's not a beautiful game, but I don't. It doesn't bother me. It really doesn't bother me. I think if it was all Starfields and other stuff, it would just get very distracting. That game's got enough going on, and it's a horrible game to teach.
Yeah.
That I do appreciate the fact that it's pretty minimal. The visuals are almost not there. But it's a phenomenal game.
So you mentioned you do some playtesting. The only thing I ever playtested was Ashes, Rise of the Phoenixborn by Playdate. Does that interest you? Like, I did it because I was just interested in the process of how a game goes from an idea to a full, a fully made thing.
Sure.
Is that something that interests you, or?
Yes and no. Interested in it, from an academic standpoint, just how different designers approach different things and how they look at different stages, and that's interesting. I don't play test a lot at all. It probably sounds like I do more than I do. I play tested ships with Martin Wallace because he was there and I was talking to him, and he said, "Do you want to try my new game?" So I said, "Sure." Matai and I, a friend of mine, we backed it on Kickstarter, and a friend of mine printed out the print and play, and that's why we played it. So other than that, if I'm playing a game that hasn't been published yet, it's usually because I'm working on it.
Yeah, like I said, I did Ashes. I don't think I'm cut out for it. I think it takes a certain type of person.
Yeah, it doesn't really appeal to me, to be honest. I don't think I'd have the attention span is probably the wrong word, but I find that if there's things in a game that I don't like, I can sour on them quite quickly. And that would probably be pretty unfair for a game that's not finished.
Right.
So I don't think my mind really works that way. I think that's a really particular skill, actually, which is probably undervalued, again, greatly. The skill of development, and I've worked with, well, no, I haven't worked with them. I've worked in the vicinity of some people who are really, really great at it, at taking a game and playing it and breaking it apart and sort of isolating, this part works really well and this part doesn't really, and this needs some work and this is almost there. That's a very particular skill set to be able to do that. And it's a very important one as well, because designers work on games for so long that, like anything, you're looking at it for so long and you're invested in it so much that you can't see the wood from the trees often. It's like a good editor, right? For a novel or whatever. And publishers, depending on the publisher, have more or less involvement in the actual game. It's not uncommon for publishers to not be hugely familiar with how the game works before they publish it. So yeah, I think it's a really undervalued skill and a really important skill for someone to go in and just develop the game.
Yeah, that actually surprised me what you're saying. I know I was talking to this one publisher about a game, and he said I've only played it twice, and that kind of blew my mind. It's like, how can you invest all this money in a game that you played twice? Yeah.
Well, I mean, the industry being the way it is, it's very rare that a game will live on past a year after being released. So I think a lot of, I mean, obviously publishers want to find that evergreen title that'll just keep on selling, but I don't know if that's not the expectation. I don't think that, this game is gonna be the one that just keeps on going. I mean, different publishers work on different models. Days of Wonder, obviously, intensely develop their games and come out with one every year, every 2 years. Whereas other publishers just publish everything, and hopefully some of them will stick. So I mean, you're publishing books or something. If Stephen King comes along and says, "I've got a new book, do you want to publish it?" You're not really going to say, "Oh, well, if it's any good." You're going to go, "Yeah, of course I do." So I think there's a little bit of that, depending on the designer and the pedigree of the designer. It will almost be an automatic yes at time. I mean, I guess it depends on the type of game it is and matching it to the publishers, but I wouldn't say it's too unusual that games get published without. And when I say the publisher, I mean, I guess the people in charge. It depends how how many people see it. Depends on the publisher, and a lot of these publishing houses are it's just one person. Yeah. So even that has its own challenges of being able to keep up a stable of games and play them and play test them properly and develop them properly and be able to get them out by the conventions and all that sort of stuff. So it's a pretty tricky juggling act, I'd imagine.
Yeah, I'm sure it is.
And then you get games like 504, for instance, right? Which is an outlier, obviously, but I mean, no publisher is ever really going to sufficiently test that game.
Yeah.
It's just not possible. But there's enough buzz behind the game, Friedman Freeze designing it. Sure. Why wouldn't you publish it?
Yeah, that's true. So you've been in the hobby a lot longer than I have. Does the rate at which we're growing worry you? Especially, they're putting out 3,000 games a year or something to that number.
No, not particularly. I don't know. There are a lot of not so great games being released. But there are a lot of really good games being released, and we're starting to see a lot more variation in themes and things like that. And I think that happens when publishers look at a broader market and a broader audience and try and accommodate those people. So I think that's really good. I think outlets for gaming are increasing. Board game cafes. I think it's Barnes and Noble, is it, that are now running board game evenings?
Yeah,
things like that. So I mean, that's all fantastic. I do think there's work to be done on the designer relationship and how board game designers are. I don't want to say valued. I don't think they're undervalued, but it really comes down to money. Unfortunately, I think that's a little unhealthy at times. As the industry grows, I think everyone involved should benefit from that, and I guess some people do, but I don't know. It's a really tough industry to try and make any money in it, despite the fact that it is growing exponentially.
Yeah, I don't think a lot of people realize the margins in the board game, the money wise.
And that's not just, it's not just designers, although I think, again, I think the industry exists because of designers. It's not because I probably shouldn't be saying that, but it's not because the art is great in games. It's not because the production's amazing. It's not because we have 3,000 of them every year, however many we have. It's because they're really good games. And that's why the hobby grows, and that's why we get new players, and that's why it, is as healthy as it is. But it's difficult. I mean, I've mentioned that in other creative industries, budgets are much bigger. I imagine in other publishing businesses, budgets are substantially larger. So yeah, it's pretty difficult for, I think, across the board.
Yeah. All right. I don't want to keep you too long.
Sure.
I don't want to keep you all night or day in your case. So if somebody came up on the street and asked you some advice about getting into the board game hobby, just the hobby, not the graphic design, what advice would you give
them? Find good people to play with. Basically, because good people will make a bad game enjoyable, and they will elevate a good game. Find good people to play with. Find people who will teach you games. And play everything. Play anything, play everything, because you never know, Don't. I mean, if, again, going back to Glory to Rome, if people had judged that on the way it looked, I might not have played it.
That's true.
So yeah, give anything a go. and yeah, play with people who want the same hobby that you do, whatever that may be.
Cool. All right, now if somebody was talking about the graphic design, what advice would you give them on that?
Specifically with games?
Yeah.
Don't put too much emphasis on the software. It's not about what software you know. You don't learn graphic design by learning InDesign, or Illustrator or Photoshop or or whatever. You need to learn graphic design. It's a craft. So my advice would be, well, just to do that, to learn the basics of typography and composition and color theory and all that sort of stuff. You can learn software. You can get books and tutorials to learn software. That's easy. With them, that will set people apart.
All right, cool. All right, so I'd like to thank everybody who's watching and who will watch later on. Is there anything else you want to hit on before we go, or?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. Okay. Thanks for coming on. I enjoyed it. Yeah,
no problem. I guess keep an eye out for Lisboa, artwork will be appearing soon. Okay. Which is Vital Lacerda's next game.
Cool. Look into it.
Yeah.
All right, so thanks for watching. Good night.
All right. Cheers, Barry.